I'd like to call to order the City of Bothell Planning Commission meeting. Tonight is Wednesday, January 22nd of 2020 at 6 p.m. here at City Hall. All commissioners are present with the exception of Commissioners Cabe and Hampton, whom are both absent and excused. It doesn't look like there's anybody in the audience for public comment, so we'll go ahead and move on, and I'll entertain an approval of the minutes from January 8th of 2020.
I move approval of the minutes.
I second the motion.
All those in favor of approval of the minutes say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously with the exception of Commissioners Cabe and Hampton, who are absent and excused. Is there any new business this evening? I do not believe so. With that, we'll go ahead and move on into the public hearing, and we'll be led tonight by Senior Planner Dave Boyd. And tonight is with regards to the Downtown Historic Preservation Code amendments, and this is a continued public hearing. And we also have Sarah Desimone with the city, a historical preservation consultant. I think I'm pretty close to the title. Okay, thanks.
Thank you and good evening. So I just have a short presentation tonight, and mostly I'm highlighting on three changes from what was presented on December 18th. But just for starters, did want to note that these are amendments that apply to historic preservation in the entire downtown sub-area. There is a focus on the to some extent on the downtown special review area outlined that extends just off this image, and a specific focus within that on Main Street. But these regulations do apply to other properties within the downtown sub-area that are eligible for the historic register, like the former Worthington building on the corner of 102nd and 183rd, as well as buildings that are actually on the historic register, like the Anderson building and the buildings at the park at Bothell Landing. The purpose of these code amendments is to preserve and restore historic structures, especially along Main Street. There's three main ways that can happen: by preserving and restoring the entire structures, by preserving and restoring the facades, and through new structures that respect and complement the historic fabric. And these code amendments apply to all three of these, with a bit of an emphasis on the preserving and restoring entire structures and facades. The three new items, the first new item that, or revised item that I'm bringing to you tonight has to do with the parking exception that we discussed on December 18th. There was a discussion about whether the code should prioritize existing structures as the pre-downtown plan code did, or whether it should prioritize ground floor retail throughout. And there was a bit of a split on the commission. I think there were 3 in favor of the status quo, 2 in favor of that liked the idea of protecting the existing buildings. And there was some concern that if we just applied this exception to existing buildings, that would be a disincentive for new infill development to fill in the gaps along Main Street. So we're proposing a slight change here. The new language is in red, and the 2 orange words added were not in the packet, but it was brought to my attention that adding those words would provide some clarity to that sentence. So how this would apply is we would still have a parking exception for existing retail uses on Main Street. And we would also have an exception for infill development that would create new, for the retail component of infill development. And the yellow bars here show the areas on Main Street where there are opportunities for infill development, either totally lots that are totally vacant of structures, for the most part parking lots, or buildings that are set back from the property line, where there would be a possibility for either redevelopment building up to the street front, or additions up to the street front. So the question for the commission is does this revision address the concerns that were expressed at the December 18th meeting? This language would not apply an exemption to a developer who buys one of these buildings and demolishes it and builds wholly anew. In that case, they would need to provide, they'd still be required to do ground floor retail fronting Main Street, but they'd have to provide parking for the entire structure, including that retail. The second one, since our last meeting, I did attend a Downtown Action Committee meeting. It's a subcommittee of the Chamber that's made up of mostly, of downtown merchants and building owners, mostly Main Street merchants and building owners, but not entirely. And they raised a concern about downtown uses. And currently, the downtown code allows, or the code in general allows, under the category of pedestrian-oriented retail, personal care services, and it gives as examples barbershops, hair salons, and tanning booths. We've since had applications for massage businesses that are more similar probably to tanning booths, where you go in and the services are provided in an enclosed space, whether a room or a cubicle. Whereas the traditional Main Street barbershop, hair salon is open to the public and provides visual interest to the street and some activity to the street as well. So the amendments that we proposed here, that are in red in the code amendments in your packet, address this by, first of all, in the definition of pedestrian-oriented retail, it says that part of that definition are retail uses that are open to the street and have transparent facades. And then the other concern among the Main Street merchants had to do with health and exercise clubs. There was some concern about seeing more of that kind of development. When the downtown, those were included as pedestrian-oriented retail uses because there were at least 2 such uses on Main Street when we adopted the code, and we were trying not to create non-conforming uses if it wasn't really felt to be necessary. And those uses do generate pedestrian traffic and provide some activity along the street front. So they were allowed, and we have tried to encourage such businesses to provide some retail sales in their storefront, but there's nothing in the code really requiring that. So the proposed amendments make a distinction between those traditional personal care services and services like tanning booths and massage businesses that are more private, and requires the latter, the more private ones, to have a functional retail space in the storefront and to maintain transparency along the storefront. It references shop front regulations in the design regulations. I think we're covered there in terms of exactly what that means, but the amendments do add some detail there. and in terms of retail storefront requirements for both of those kinds of uses. So that's number 2. Number 3 is an issue that we had introduced on December 18th. We had kind of tabled that pending legal review, further legal review. So this is the solution that we've came up with to the concerns from the city attorney. We're still, well, first of all, we're making this a guideline, not a requirement. So we're encouraging new development on these buildings to maintain the street front, which the store front line, which is about 4 feet back of the property line. We're offsetting that with a reduced upper level setback. So current code allows or requires 2 floors to come up to the property line, and then above that there's a setback, 20-foot setback for the upper floors, and this zone does allow 6 stories of development. Whether any properties could actually achieve that and provide parking for that remains to be seen, but if they could, this reduces that 20-foot upper level setback to 18 feet. So you're losing 4 feet on 2 stores, but you're gaining 2 feet on 4 stores. So it equals out. And the requirement, just in terms of how it fits into the code, we've referenced this special exception in the downtown core district requirements, so that somebody looking at setbacks wouldn't miss this provision in the historic resources regulations section of the code. So those are the 3 major changes. There are also some minor changes to the canopies regulations. There was just one section where we had, in the introductory section, had added canopies to awnings. It previously had only addressed awnings, but we realized there were some other references to canopies that should be made there. So those are the 3 things that are new. I think the rest of it we've had ample opportunity to review. With that, open it up for any questions or comments on the presentation, and then open up for review of these 3 issues, and then review of the and approval of the proposed findings, conclusions, and recommendation, which include the proposed code amendments as an exhibit. And Councilmember Kiernan did point out on the findings and the conclusions a carryover from a previous one that will need to be changed. It references at the, and I do have copies of these that I can pull up on the screen, but I just did want to reference that one since it was brought to my attention. On conclusion number 2, at the end of that section, and this is on page 17 of your packet, page 4 of the findings, strike the words development of nursing homes and replace those with protection of historic resources in the downtown sub-area. So with that, I open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dave. I particularly liked the, well, thank you for showing us the visual, because I don't think of a lot of gaps on Main Street, but there's a lot of gaps on Main Street. I just don't think of them as gaps, but they are. So thanks for showing that visual. That was pretty important.
Also, I have included, or I have available slides of some of the other issues that we've discussed to date, if you commission does want to get into any of those other issues.
Okay. Any commissioners have any questions or comments? Commissioner Kiernan?
Well, to start with, I like the parking exception as written, so I think that's a good change. On the, existing and infill. So I think that's a good change, and I support that. On the third issue, the north side setback, so exactly what does it mean encouraged? It said should, it's not shall. What,
The concern was that since the general requirement in the downtown core is a 0 minimum, 0 maximum setback, that by having this special exception just for this block, we may open ourselves up to challenges. And rather than just relying on working with developers on a case-by-case basis, should this issue come up in the future, the city attorney thought it was his problem with the code amendment as it was written was the word should or shall. So I said, well, if this includes both requirements and guidelines. If we make a guideline, we're still letting prospective developers know the intent that we would like to see, and he felt that was a sufficient change. In all likelihood, like I said, because of the challenge of going up to the full height and providing parking for that on these parcels, some of which have the parcel behind with some parking and potential at least for structured parking, but others don't. We think it's relatively unlikely, and also with the additional code amendments that we're making to either require and encourage preservation of the existing buildings, we think it's unlikely that we'll have redevelopment on this block. So we're fairly comfortable with this as a guideline. It will alert prospective developers that's the intent.
so to restate that, if a developer were to propose something which would, I'll use the word encroach, it's probably not the right word, but on that setback, they would lose this parking exemption and be required to provide parking for both the ground floor retail and any development above it, which would otherwise be exempted.
Correct.
By what we're doing today. Okay,
And
thank
they
you.
wouldn't have available the smaller upper level setback. And we think that the difference between a 18 and a 20-foot setback won't be noticeable to anyone on the street, and especially given that it's on the north side and therefore doesn't impact shading of the street.
Okay, thank you.
And so, Dave, going back to that slide with the yellow, the gaps on Main Street, per se, where in the code, so when any of these gaps are filled in the future, I guess there's varying types of, like, as you mentioned, historical facades on Main Street. And so what are the requirements for the development community to be able to kind of integrate their building into to look not like hardy plank siding that's going to be the most affordable way for them to develop a property?
So there are, in the downtown code, there are requirements and guidelines for things like wall treatments, base treatments that already do encourage brick or stone as base treatments. They're not, those are our guidelines. They're not requirements because, well, the downtown and Main Street is eclectic. It has buildings from a number of different eras, and there is an argument to be made that that the buildings should reflect the era that they're built in. But in addition to that, the storefront regulations get at what I think is really the core of that pedestrian-oriented experience, which is the sort of fine-grained window door experience that you have as you walk along Main Street. So we feel that there's enough direction within that to to make sure that there are high quality materials that are used, and that the development has those elements. And then if they do go up, there's requirements for what we call modulation, that will break up the building mass, so that the new section that extends up will have some variation in it as well.
And is there, right. So I just thought about this as you were talking about it, especially having been at the fire on Main Street, could have jumped significantly further had it not been for a couple things. And I feel like one of them was kind of a breezeway between a couple buildings that might have helped. So is there going to be, what is there in the code with regards to any time of passages between buildings? Or are we basically looking for building to building, and how do people get from one, if they want to get to the back or the front, do they walk around or walk through a business?
The code doesn't directly address that. There are, so there is a requirement that for 100% building frontage, but if there is also a provision for passages.
Okay.
And
Perfect.
they can act as building in that set. So we certainly allow those passages.
Okay.
And would work with any redevelopment to try to maintain some connection between, because that is an important connection from the parking to the main street.
Great. Thank you. Commissioner Curd.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. I agree with the terminology that you use for the parking exception. That adequately describes kind of what we were getting at, while still maintaining that the goal of all of these amendments is to further the preservation of Main Street. One of the things that I was kind of confused reading through the special height restrictions was the terminology or the reference. I'm not sure if the figure number is correct. Should it be the last reference of that string of numbers and letters should be 3 instead of 2, or if there is an additional reference to the new construction in number 2. Does that make sense? It's at the bottom of page 19, as well as on
That's
page
a good catch.
12.
That should be triple I at the end of that.
Okay. That's the only thing that I noticed, but I think that including this figure is really helpful to understand the heart of these recommendations. So I really like that figure. Other than that, I think everything is really comprehensively written according to our previous recommendations. So yeah, thanks.
So I've noted the change to that reference in the district requirements and also in the figure itself. Okay. So it matches the section of the code that it's in.
Great.
And Dave, just to clarify, one question I do have too, just for myself and maybe the other commissioners for the future. So the Main Street and Commerce, or the meeting you went to, and you said there was some concern or question about like health clubs or that sort of. I'm not quite. Is it because they're not walking in, buying something, or sitting down at a table and then leave? It's just a different kind of thing, because I feel like it provides a lot of activity. It seems like it provides a lot of people coming and going, but maybe it's just they're coming and they're going and they're just.
Yeah, I think it just doesn't necessarily match most people's idea of what pedestrian-oriented retail is, and they can, for example, the karate club has classes mostly in the evening, so during the day it's kind of an empty storefront, not a lot of activity. So that, and I think the other thing that brought that up is that there is talk, at least, we haven't seen an actual proposal of a new health club type use along Main Street. So that had raised some concerns.
Okay, thank you. So Dave, I see that you've, so we could continue this again, should we need to, but the staff is hoping that we can wrap this up tonight. Is that, okay. I just looked ahead. I don't know if does the commission want to walk through this, or do you have any additional questions this week, or do we need some further discussion amongst ourselves? 'Cause we could go ahead and, I guess we could go ahead and close the public comment and just do a discussion and then go ahead and move forward with a motion, correct? Okay.
Yeah, a motion to close the public hearing would be in order.
Okay.
I move we close the public hearing.
I second the motion.
All those in favor of the motion on the table say aye. Aye. Motion carries unanimously with Commissioners Hampton and Cabe absent and excused. Okay, we can go ahead and now move on to the discussion phase.
And I do have the packet and the actual findings and code language available if you want to go through them page by page. But if you're comfortable with moving ahead with the recommendation based on the changes that we've discussed, you can do that as well.
I guess we could go through, let's see. So we go through the findings, conclusions, recommendations pages. Is that what we do? Well, actually, that doesn't really get us any. I think it's more of just if the commissioners have any particular questions or things they want to state. And then if you could also, okay, yeah, let's just bring those up then. I don't think there's anything on the first page there, Dave. If there's anything with the commission, is there any questions or anything people want to discuss with regards to this, other than maybe what you guys have commented on with regards to parking requirements? And I think I'm also in favor of what staff has brought us with regards to parking requirements and the changes that were made there, as well as all the other changes that were made. Mr. Price.
One thing I still kind of unclear on is not new infill projects, existing buildings. Let's say I'm a new restaurant, whatever, opening up. You talk about transparent glass. I want rolling doors for the summertime. Does that fit into the, I forgot where it was, but.
Yeah, well, if they're glazed rolling doors, like on the Vine is an example.
That was my comment, is walking up and down Main Street, you see a cool place. It doesn't necessarily look like the building next door, but I think it really fits into where we want to go as a city to bring people in. Hey, it's kind of a cool place. It's got roll-up doors in summer. You open them up. I just wasn't sure if that's noted in here for existing facilities. You talk about canopies, that kind of thing. You talk about glass door.
Yeah.
Is there something within that says within this there are things that we can look at?
Well, the main purpose of the historic resources regulations is to identify the historic elements that we are interested in preserving.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that you can't do other things like the roll-up doors at the Vine, but yeah, they would have to be glazed roll-up doors so that whether they're open and closed, there's a visual connection there.
Sure. Okay.
And in that particular building, that was a building that wasn't deemed eligible for the register. It had been modified quite a bit. I'm not even sure if it was old enough in its current incarnation. But there are other buildings that are considered eligible for the register where we probably wouldn't want to see a roll-up doors. So there are places where it can work, but yeah, not everywhere.
Thanks, Dave.
Good question. Thank you. Commissioner Curd.
Something I'd like to discuss is the what was newly brought to commission today about the personal care services. So part of accessible urbanism and just when normal people who don't have any idea about zoning or regulations go and walk down a street like Main Street, like say in Mount Vernon or in Everett, you go and walk down these areas that have shops on either side of the street, and you go and you look and you something that brings people in to a community is being able to see interesting things that catch your eye when you walk down, and oftentimes that's kind of enshrined in regulation with these sort of open spaces in the front of the structures that have windows with displays, maybe seasonal displays, that sort of thing. And so something that I feel like maybe what we're doing here in these historic preservation code amendments is we're trying to get at that kind of regulation of the look and the feel of each individual storefront, but we're applying it to the use rather than to just the like retail period. And I don't know if that's really clear or not, or I'm just interested in what other people think about that, where we're specifically calling out these personal care services. And maybe that's because in the experience of the planning department, these types of uses have more of an issue in making these accessible and interesting looking storefronts. But I just want to hear from other people what they think about that.
Well, my impression is that this section we see here on health and exercise clubs is an excerpt, and are there other elements of the code, other uses that are identified?
There are, and I didn't. I could pull that up online if you would like to look at all the uses. These are the two that have
The issues have been raised.
And you're absolutely right. It doesn't just apply to these uses, so that's why I added the phrase in the definition of pedestrian-oriented retail. So it does apply to all, and we felt because of the issues that have been raised with both of these uses that they warranted this footnote in the use table. One reason we didn't just split out the more private personal care services from the more public traditional ones is that the way the tables are set up, it has those types of uses and all of the districts where they're allowed. So it just became a little more cumbersome. This seemed to be the most straightforward way to address the issue. So, for example, this regulation wouldn't necessarily apply to a tanning booth business in a strip mall in a different part. This is really focused on the Main Street issues.
Yeah, I understand that the reasoning behind doing this, and this is certainly one way to do it. I'm just not sure if maybe the decision is up to planning director to, based on feedback from the community about these, if that's something that necessarily needs to be put in words here, or if it's just helpful to set the precedent going forward that these types of uses are meant to be pedestrian oriented. I mean, it would follow that all uses should strive to be pedestrian oriented on a walkable Main Street, but I was just wondering what other people thought of that. I agree with the way it's written, and I think that it will be effective, but I don't know if we're setting a precedent going forward that we'll have to be qualifying each and every use in every table. I'm just thinking, when we get into doing other zoning areas, maybe like in Canyon Park, if we're going to be needing to take more of an approach of, writing out our intention in each and every statement. I don't know. If anyone else has comment, that's cool.
No, I can appreciate that. I see I think what you're getting at. I guess in this case, I guess it is something that sounds like has been brought up, and I guess that's kind of when things do or don't decide to get moved into some kind of code change. And I kind of like the way it's written here, but I can also understand, do we want to be specifying out all these things in any district that we look at and investigate? I don't know. It seems like, I don't know. I'm open to other suggestions, though, but I think it's okay with the way it's written. But
So, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, Commissioner Kieran wants to.
I was going to say, I'm comfortable with it as written. I think we do have Main Street as a special case within the city of Bothell. So there are some, for instance, the setback is something that we're not going to see anywhere else that we have here. So this is not alone in being unique to Main Street. The concerns that were raised resonate, that having a use that doesn't really feel like it's part of the activity on the street, doesn't go where we want to go on Main Street, and some of those uses, as Dave mentioned, are pretty quiet for big chunks of the day. So having these functional retail space storefront to give more of a sense of an activity going on is something that I support. So I like it as written.
okay, yes. Thanks for the question. That's a good one. I'm sure we'll get into that. Oh, yes, Community Director Cotterman.
I was just going to offer an example. If I understand where you're going with the question in terms of what uses would we need to capture in here. Using the massage business as an example, that was something that was not listed in the code. That's a proposed change. We are able to allow the massage in those storefront areas because of the conditions, the provisions that are in here, and because of the authority that I have to make a decision. If something is not included, then my staff and I look at what's similar. Does it align with something else that's there? Does it meet the other requirements that we're looking at? And we make an interpretation, basically, because we're never going to anticipate every single type of use, and they change over time as well. So that's the mechanism that we have to address that type of situation. And I think in this case in particular, the important part is, regardless of what we may have to interpret, if they can't meet the requirements of providing that retail-like space that creates that visual interest, that pedestrian activity, then it wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't allow it. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
It does, thanks. And I trust the planning department in your judgment, but I'm just wondering if it's a matter of whether we want to be specific or if we want to be general, and it's always good to be specific. So it's just for discussion, but thank you, that's helpful.
Great. And Dave, could you pull up again just the main things that you wanted to cover tonight with regards to the changes? I think there were like about 3 different topics.
Yeah, well, the use provisions were one. The parking was the other, and then the
Okay.
setback.
Okay.
Get to that.
Do any of the commissioners have anything further discussion with regards to those topics? Okay. Great. Okay. Well, with that, I guess we can entertain a motion then on the proposal. Can you direct us towards, here we go.
So
With regards to a motion,
if you're ready for that, I think just a motion to approve the findings, which include the proposed code amendments as an exhibit, would be the
Okay, I'll entertain a motion
findings,
for,
conclusions, and recommendation.
I would move that we adopt the findings, conclusions, and recommendations as conclusion 2 amended, for your previous comment, and the attached code amendments as provided.
I second that.
okay. All those in favor of the motion on the table, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay. The motion carries unanimously with the exception of Commissioners Cabe and Hampton, who are absent and excused.
Thank you. And we're going to, Bruce wanted to go into study session format for his section of the meeting, so he suggested that we take a short break, and we'll set up for that and move down to the floor for a little more informal discussion on Canyon Park.
Great, thanks. And thanks again for Sarah for staying late with us this evening. Okay, so we'll take a short break and reset the tables and be reconvening in about 10 minutes, 6:52. And we are back with the City of Bothell Planning Commission meeting. And with that, we will go ahead and move into the study session for Canyon Park briefing and project schedule. And we'll be led by Senior Planner Bruce Blackburn.
Good evening, Chair and the rest of the commission members. This is a really amazing project that we're getting into. And I want to introduce all of us here. Of course, I'm Bruce Blackburn, in the City of Bothell. To my left here is Rachel Miller with Makers Architecture. We have Carmen Kwan with Farron Piers Transportation Consultants. We have Lisa Guider with Burke Consultants. And basically what their team is comprised of is Makers is urban planning, design, architecture. Farron Piers, of course, is transportation, heavy in transportation. Burke is environmental. They are environmental experts on particularly the environmental impact statement. And the intent of this discussion is to talk about the preferred alternative. We're coming to a point now where we've got the draft environmental impact statement, not the final. The draft environmental impact statement has been released. We have received approximately 15 written comments and a few other comments. We've had a lot of public engagement, including a meeting out in the Canyon Park area regarding some of the transportation issues we've been having. And this is kind of the chance for the Planning Commission to really think about what the preferred alternative should look like. Within the packet, I included some additional information for you folks. You've been seeing a lot of some of the action alternatives in the DEI, so we've got lots of information about that. But this will be the first time you've really had a chance to look at what could be a preferred alternative. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Miller because she knows a lot more about this than I do. And she's going to lead the effort on this particular presentation. So thank you.
Thanks for having us here. Thanks, Bruce. This is a really exciting project for us because it's such a challenge, I'll say. And it makes us think about what good planning is for this area and what the folks here really want to see happen and how to get there. So as Bruce mentioned, tonight we're here mostly to catch you up on what we've been up to in the last couple months since whenever you've last heard about Canyon Park, and then understand what you all are thinking in terms of the preferred alternative. So tonight we're going to talk about what we've been doing, where we're going, some things we've heard from the recent engagement, and later we'll talk a little bit about what we heard in the DEIS comments as well, and talk about the direction we're kind of leaning and where we're going to go now that we have all this analysis behind us. And then we want to talk with you a lot more about that and hear what you all are thinking. So again, just a reminder, why are we even talking about planning for Canyon Park? There are thousands of high-tech and biomedical jobs, and we keep hearing about more and more. Recently, just almost 300 coming online soon. So regional transportation is a major part of this. It's a host to regional transportation corridors working for the region. The potential for growth is there. There's a lot of low density or places for infill. So there's a route for change. And there's an opportunity for jobs and residents to be here together and to make more of a holistic neighborhood that we've heard a lot of people are looking for. So what's the challenge? Why did I open saying this is a challenge? Because of those regional assets, I-405, Bothell Everett Highway, the Park and Ride, these massive wetlands that are really wonderful, important things doing lots of services for the whole area, they complicate the local transportation. And our analysis is really starting to show that, that it's really tricky. It's tough at the local level, dealing with all these big, massive, important things. If we do nothing, it will get worse. So we do need a path forward, and one of those ways to be ready for the changes is to maintain a regional growth center status, and I'll talk more about what that means, but that does allow us to get the funding that is funneled through PSRC. So we just need to show how we would maintain that regional growth center status and how we can address the challenges and allow for that growth in a positive way. We're also in changing times. So the businesses have been asking for more amenities for their workers to keep attracting workers to the area. People have been asking for more mixed uses in the area, so people can walk and live much closer to each other. And then we are seeing generally a transportation shift. More and more people are riding buses or riding bikes or walking, and that is a change that is happening in the region. So we want to ensure that all of those challenges are met and that there is positive change, and we're actually making Canyon Park a better place through all of this. So just a little bit on schedule. We are wrapping up the draft environmental impact statement, and that was issued in December in 2019. And you can see we're in the comment period. And then up here, what we're doing with you all tonight is kicking off the preferred alternative phase. So really figuring out, okay, here's what we analyzed, and now what does that mean for us, and what questions do we need to answer tonight on how to move forward. We also have a lot of pieces coming up. We just finished the 9th Ave workshop, this interagency transportation advisory committee meeting unfortunately was snowed out last week or the week before. So we've rescheduled that. It's coming up soon. And then the 20th Ave workshop, similar to this 9th Ave workshop, we're trying to have these local events with folks that we know may feel impacted by the proposals that are in the DEIS. So the 20th Ave is 1 year, another street extension, and then this business park, Streets Charette, we have been wanting to take a closer look at the internal streets for a long time. And so this is one way to do that with the business and property owners, and that should be coming up in a couple weeks as well. So then we'll get into drafting the sub-area plan more, wrapping up all the ideas that you see kind of scattered throughout the EIS documents and materials, pulling them together as a vision forward for the whole area, and then figuring out how to get it done, and then wrapping it all up, and then making sure that our environmental impact statement is working alongside that. Then later on, we'll get into the draft regulations, and so what are the actual ways of implementing the sub-area plan through code, development code, and perhaps design guidelines. So you all probably have been given briefings along the way. I just wanted to show just how many things Bruce has really been through on this project. So since 2017, these are all the different things that we've done, and there's more behind the scenes work I'm sure that I didn't even capture on this. So lots of meetings, lots of surveys, different ways of getting to people. And again, these coming up ones are going to be pretty important for our understanding of those areas.
Rachel?
Yeah.
Push the mic away just a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you.
We don't have a lot of people in the room, so.
Yeah, you don't actually need it. So this is just one slide representing the results from the online survey, which had about 333 people take the survey. And I saved this one because all the rest of our engagement corroborated this. So the wetlands and the natural areas are really important to people. And in terms of, so that's what they like to preserve. But in terms of what they're worried about is the traffic. And depending on how you ask about it, sometimes it seems even worse than this. But the traffic is always what they're worried about. But you will see that there are a lot of people interested in pedestrian networks, transit, more mixed restaurant and amenities. Over here, the jobs and the small businesses are really important to people. And again, the trails are something that people value and would like to improve as well. So a little on what this region or what this sub-area needs to do to get that Puget Sound Regional Council Regional Growth Center status. We know that we need 15,000 people, or we know that we have 15,000 people in Canyon Park right now. So mostly jobs, a little bit of residents. We need to add 13,700 new people. So again, that's a mix of residents and workers to get to the density that PSRC would like to see in regional growth centers. That's 45 people per acre is what PSRC would like to see. The current density is around 17 people per acre. They call it activity units per acre, but that essentially is a person. We also need a mix that 15% is residential, but a bigger constraint for us or opportunity for us is that 4,500 new residents are needed to meet the Bothell's growth targets. So these are the targets that we're trying to meet through all of our alternative work. So I'm going to let Lisa talk a little bit about where we started with on the numbers.
Under the State Environmental Policy Act, one of the required alternatives is the no action alternative, but in a planning context, that means your current plan. So we took a look at the buildable land results from 2012, which was the last thorough update of the report. There's a new one underway now. We also looked at the work that the city did for its comprehensive plan update in 2015, where some areas were changed in terms of zoning and allowing for more mixed use. We've also been looking at recent permit trends, so pipeline developments and updated parcel information, and came up with an estimate that is fairly similar to what we saw published in the city's comprehensive plan. So our goal was just to sort of represent what the intent was of the comprehensive plan. So there's a number of steps to get there in terms of looking at the land and what is redevelopable or vacant or partially used, and subtracting critical areas and multiplying by recent densities achieved in the area. And of course, looking at the net difference above existing jobs and so on, and adding in permit information. So that gave us our starting point for the no action. We did receive some comments through the draft EIS comment period to take a closer look at some of that analysis. So we will be doing that as part of the final EIS.
Okay, so I mentioned how immense the growth is that we're expecting. So it's not quite doubling, but it's a lot. And so one of the things that has gotten very interesting and unique about this project is the changing boundary and trying to deal with those densities. So you see a bunch of boundaries here. The point is that we've shrunk the boundary over time as we worked trying to get the least amount of growth and still meet the regional growth center minimum density of 45 AUs per acre. Oops. Yeah, I accidentally pressed the wrong. Nope, got it. That worked.
Go back then. So one of the things you talked about is sorry. So one of the things you talked about was the residential requirement. Now, one of the changes here took out a big residential chunk in that kind of southern piece there.
Are you talking about?
Nope, that. Oh, that one.
That was never in the original regional growth center boundary.
Okay.
That's an.
Okay, I'm looking at the sub.
Yeah.
I guess I'm confusing the sub area at the regional growth center.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the dashed line, the heavier dashed
Yes,
line
yes.
that's the
Yeah.
current
Okay.
RGC.
Okay, so there really aren't any large residential or any significant residential population at all in this area right now. Is that correct?
In general, yes, in general, I think that's correct. There is a fairly dense townhome development, and there's a relatively small multifamily right there where Rachel is pointing as well. So, yeah, it's not a significant amount of residential in comparison to the employment we have in the area.
So that town hall, that's kind of south of Fred Meyer. I'm trying to see through the shading
Yeah, the Fred Meyer is right up
right
here.
there. So, okay, the other side of the street south there. All right, thank you.
So we looked at a number of alternatives for the environmental impact statement draft. We started with the no action. And so if we just follow general comp plan direction and trends, what would we see happen here? And using the comp plan transportation projects, what does that result in? So that was our no action alternative. And then the business plus and the live work were the action alternatives. And they were provided to show us, okay, if we, what's the bookend of the growth that we could see here? And then when we saw how great that growth was and the impacts of those, we worked back a little bit and came up with a mitigated live-work solution or alternative. So the no action scenario, again, was just following trends. So this is a current zoning map, just to remind everybody. It actually already allows quite a bit. So the big changes when we get into the action areas are in more of the regional shopping centers. But the point here is that it's quite a bit of growth still, about 8,000 new people, and has a mix of 31% residential. So these were our action alternatives and assumed a lot of growth for us to find out what that would mean. And so this is what I want you to notice here is just that the Business Plus assumes a lot more jobs-oriented land uses, and the Live Work assumes a lot more residential uses. That's the big difference between the two.
Rachel, so remind us of these new people, like in what time frame, or is that's just the capacity?
It's to year 2043. Is that right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the mitigated live work, again, we shrunk down the regional growth center boundary so that we could come up with lower numbers. And so with just about less than 14,000 people and still getting a good mix of residential. It used the same land use mix as the live work, since that had ended up being the most impactful. That's the one that we mitigated. And it also gave more flexibility to meeting that 4,500 people needed per the Bothell growth targets. So you all may have handouts that have these alternatives in front of you. And I did want to pause on these for a little bit either way. So we're talking a lot about land use mix and just the numbers and what we needed to do for the growth targets, but there are a lot of other ideas that have been floating around the team's work. And some of those include open space. So these stars are ideas for conceptual locations for gathering spaces that would start to create a center of a neighborhood. The bright pink lines near them would be sort of Main Street type neighborhood center streets. And so as redevelopment comes in, it could be required with active ground floors or things that start to make a more connected and lively, not 24/7, but getting there type of place. In addition, connecting to the North Creek Trail, we had heard that that was a major objective, is making this a unifying feature of the area. So there are ideas peppered throughout that would start to create more holistic neighborhoods and really start to connect to the existing residences that are just outside of the planning area. I should point out, these circles are around the major transit hubs. So a quarter mile, about a 5-minute walk, and half mile, about a 10-minute walk. So we put that draft out there with those action alternatives and the mitigated live work alternative. And these are some of the things we learned. And overarching concerns, this photo is from the 214th or 9th Ave Community Workshop. And there's a lot of concern about an extension from the residents living in the area. A major piece from the DEIS comments was just looking at the appropriateness of the regional growth center, whether or not it's worth it to propose that much growth to maintain this criteria. And then with the amount of growth that's proposed, are we also looking at adequate and feasible mitigation? And taking another look at the infrastructure and services capacity and making sure that it's all lining up. The traffic analyses, taking a little closer look at the AM peak and internal streets and different topics in there. So there are some suggestions to also look at different street extensions and just good ideas for trends around curb space for deliveries and transportation network companies. So people that are dropping off and picking up more rather than parking somewhere permanently. And other ideas came in, also just like stronger ecological design with redevelopment. So lots of good ideas in the comment letters. There was a lot of support for pedestrian and bicycle connections and just general safety for people not in a car moving through the area. And there was a lot of support for mixed use and transit-oriented development. So after hearing that, we are starting to look at those alternatives and see what is the right path, what's the right land use mix moving forward. Are the transportation mitigation projects the right ones still in there? And so this is one path forward. It's just a potential middle ground between the Business Plus and the Live Work. So you see it kind of mixes the two, where it compromises a lot more. It doesn't take jobs all the way through, but it also doesn't take residences as far. So it really focuses in the red areas, the TOD areas, retail required on the ground floor, and is the highest minimum densities. We'll get into that a little more. The bright pink or dark pink is the medium area, so retail could be encouraged. And then moving further from there, retail could be allowed. And in these areas, residential or office could come in. It would be left open to market and other factors. The rest of the area would mostly be pretty similar to as it is today, potentially asking for higher densities than are there now, and encouraging, of course, growth that would come in and connect to the transit stations and connect to the neighborhood around. So in these areas, we would expect them to be more residential.
Question. So over, but it does say low retail allowed on the far right, kind of over in that section. So there would be some, low no retail, but the actual lighter purple, I guess?
Yes.
So that's all low, but there is some capacity to allow for it.
Yes.
Okay, because it seems to me in my mind it would be, I know there's a lot of businesses over there, but it also would be nice to have potential small retailers, at least somewhere to go get lunch or something like that, so that all those people didn't have to drive somewhere.
I think you're right on, and that fits right in with the what we've heard, that people want more amenities when they're working in the business park. Okay. So again, just reiterating, where we expect the most change to happen would be along the corridor and really focusing on transit-oriented development around these transit hubs. We wish that we could say a little bit more, but it's a little bit outside of our purview to be looking north of Maltby Road. So the uses, one interesting thing we'd like to point out is that we could propose not allowing residential in this area. And that is because we've heard that the residential is kind of overpowering the market for office development, or the types of businesses that are there now, that they feel a lot of pressure by the residential development. And so to protect smaller businesses or existing businesses, the range of businesses that are there, that is one option. And the height, and this is our big kind of bargaining chip, is that these areas here would see a height increase. They're either 35 or 65, depending on what they do currently, so they would get at least a 10-foot height increase. In terms of densities, this is where we really have to connect it back to the PSRC requirements. And what we've talked with PSRC about doing is keeping minimum low densities, or minimum densities that get us some part of the way there, but then show PSRC how we would invest in the area and how we could set a path forward for the density to be achieved, even at higher densities than the minimum that we set. But still just achieve that 45 activity units per acre. Our other big bargaining chip is reducing parking requirements. And so this is looking at reducing parking to be closer to the downtown requirements. In terms of urban design, things that we can require with redevelopment or incentivize in some way is through block connections. So right now, these are all acting as pretty huge super blocks. They do have parking lots right now that you can cut through, but with redevelopment, the idea would be that you could break that down into smaller blocks, more like every 300 feet or so. Open space as well. With residential, we would expect that there would be common usable space as well as private space, private open space. Commercial, that's a little bit more flexible, and we're still talking through what exactly that means. But there could be some common usable open space. And again, this is coming from the idea that people are enjoying the idea of amenities in the area and letting it act as a more holistic neighborhood. There might be some that could be useful, but it might not be a huge focus. And again, encouraging these central gathering spaces that would be really important to creating some focused activity areas. And the main streets, activating the ground floors, having frequent entries, and considerations for small businesses. So I'm going to let Carmen talk more about transportation.
Great. So I'm going to quickly go over some of the transportation analysis that we completed in the draft EIS. Up on the screen here, I have a map of the PM peak hour traffic operations analysis for the main signalized intersections in this Canyon Park area. And so when we look at traffic operations, we're looking at level of service grades A through F, and they're just like what you would get while you're in school. A means limited congestion, F means failing and overcapacity streets. So on the left here, we have today's existing conditions. Individual intersections and concurrency corridors are at LOS C and D, so we are meeting the city's level of service standard of LOS E along these corridors. And I wanted to share on the right what we are seeing for 2043 no action. It follows very closely to what Rachel had said, which is if we do nothing in this area, we expect congestion to increase, intersections to operate at LOSF during peak hours, and we also expect 2 concurrency corridors to fail at LOSF. So that would be Bothell Everett Highway, or SR 527, and Maltby Road, SR 524.
Oh, Carmen, can I ask a question? So when those numbers, the E and F and A through F, how are those generated? Are they through electronics you drive over, or is there somebody counting, or how does that work? How do we get those numbers?
We use
those letters.
We use a software called Synchro to evaluate peak hour intersection operations. And so we'll enter in traffic signal timing, turning movement volumes, and then we estimate what the average vehicle delay in seconds are at that intersection.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to focus on the mitigated live-work scenario that we're here to talk about. As Rachel mentioned, with the action alternatives, we were proposing a lot of growth in this area. So this mitigated live-work scenario is where we reduced the total land use growth for the sub-area. We assumed a requirement of travel demand management strategies, so strategies that will help shift people away from SOV travel during the PM peak hour. And then we also assumed additional transportation improvement projects at some of these main intersections. With all of that combined together, when we take a look at the traffic operations in the PM peak hour in the future. We continue to see intersections that are expected to fail during peak congestion, peak commute hours, and we still see the Maltby Road and Bothell Everett Highway corridors operating at LOSF. So this is kind of a list of all the mitigation strategies that we've been considering to date as we evaluated this mitigated live-work scenario. And it's really just to show the amount of thought that we've gone into to see what kind of transportation policies or actual transportation facilities that we could modify in the area to help support the amount of growth proposed. We've looked at roundabouts along the corridor, new bat lanes along SR 527 to see if we can improve transit travel. We considered for some time some sort of grade separated project for the area. However, that's considered too expensive. We looked at potentially a new interchange of 405, that type of thing. The list goes on. And so we've coordinated with city staff and also agency representatives such as Snohomish County, Community Transit to talk through some of these things up to this point. So on the right here, we have a map of the PM peak hour volumes, and in blue, those are the numbers of the 2043 mitigated live-work alternative. And I've highlighted the amount of peak hour traffic growth we're expecting at various points between today's kind of 2019 counts out to 2043. So the whole live-work mitigated scenario is expected to generate an additional 6,500 PM peak hour trips. They are distributed across the network, but given Canyon Park's limited street connection and constraints with 405, they are heavily distributed across SR 527, Maltby Road, and 228th Street. You guys have also received, I think on the flip side of the piece of paper, some of the proposed transportation improvement projects in the area. We've got highlighted the ones that are planned, such as in the city's comprehensive plan, as well as additional projects that were considered part of this mitigated live-work scenario.
Okay.
So now, I'm handing it back to Rachel.
All right, so that was a lot thrown at you. Are there any other questions from you all just to clarify what we went through?
So either way, we're kind of going to encounter, judging by your traffic analysis, it's going to be worse than it is no matter which way you go.
Yeah.
Whether it be live work, whether it be do nothing, there's no change.
That's right.
So my question is, when the PSRC says jump, we say how high? Why do we want to even entertain doing what they tell us we need to be in 2043? I guess, Michael, this might be a question for you. What are the benefits that we see as a city if we do this? Because right now I'm seeing we're heading for this conclusion. No matter which way we dice it up, it's going to be the same result.
So a few things to keep in mind. One is we currently have the regional growth center designation. That's something that the city sought. That was a decision that was made a long time ago by the city to do that. One of the main benefits of that is that we're much more competitive for transportation funding from the federal government that comes through the PSRC. It was also part of a policy decision on the part of the city to accept the growth that's coming to this area. There are pluses and minuses to that, but that was the policy decision that was made, and we're continuing that. So the reason we're responding to PSRC at this point is because they recently changed the framework criteria. They increased the requirements for the amount of activity units, for example, that are required. So we're making sure that we meet those requirements in order to retain that designation. And that's something that is still a priority for the city council as well. So that's the background, and that's why we're doing this. I'd like to, if I could, and Carmen, correct me if I say something that's more in the planner perspective of things, but it's incorrect from a transportation standpoint. The way that the level of service, those letters work, and I think we've talked a little bit about this before, is we set a level of service that is acceptable. That's a policy decision that each city council or county council makes on their own. We happen to use the system that goes A through F, like grades in the school. F, in our case, means failing because we've said a level E is acceptable. So if it's beyond E, then we trip concurrency, and we're saying, then we have some choices to make. We either have to make improvements, or we have to deny development, or we change our level of service and say we're willing to live with a lower level of service than the one that's been set. That's the way the growth management is set up. It's not saying that you can't do these things. It's saying that you have to make conscious decisions and informed decisions about what you're willing to live with, what trade-offs you're willing to make. So we can change that to F or G or Z if we wanted to. That's a decision that the council would have to make at some point. Have I said anything wrong yet?
I will just say there's no LOS, G, or Z, but
Not in our current system, no.
But I just wanted to add, there are other cities in the region and regional growth centers that have their level of service policy set at a different standard, where they do accept higher levels of congestion during peak hours.
Well, because no one in their right mind is going to go through Canyon Park between hours of 4:30 and 6. I mean, I don't choose to go do that if I don't have to.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do differently here with level of service that others probably do it, but most use it on an intersection by intersection basis. And as Carmen was explaining, we look at it on the corridor basis. So we may have several failing intersections, but if the corridor functions at that level of service, then that's still acceptable. It still meets our requirements.
And you mentioned something about funding for transportation regional projects.
Yes.
And to my knowledge, light rail is not going to be coming up 405 anytime soon, if ever. So are these transportation projects obviously bus related?
They can be, the way they're laid out is they're typically for, transportation is a little more broadly defined. Typically, the roadway projects, they have a certain amount of funds that they set aside for roadways. They have some that they set aside for transit. They also have some that they set aside for bicycle and pedestrian improvements. So it really covers the gamut. Obviously, what we'd be looking at would be more of the roadway transit and the pedestrian.
And would we be competing for funds with other cities inside within regional growth centers and non-regional growth centers?
That's correct. Yeah, we compete with all the jurisdictions in the 4-county area that are within PSRC. Regional growth centers receive additional points for being a regional growth center. That's why we're more competitive for that. There's also a countywide fund that comes out of those funds that are designated to each county, so we also then can compete for Snohomish County funds that are set aside for each of the 4 counties. So there are a lot of different opportunities for that, and again, it just makes us more competitive. But it is a competition, and we would use what we come up with in terms of the plan to identify the projects that we would then take to the PSRC to compete for those dollars. And obviously, there are other funding sources available, federal funds, other federal funds, and state funds that we would pursue as well. The other thing that I wanted to point out is what we're talking about here in Canyon Park in particular, and Carmen mentioned this, the 2 main corridors that we're talking about are both state roads. And so we're also relying on the state to a large extent to be able to help with those. We don't completely control what happens in those rights of way. That was more than you asked. I'm sorry.
Thank you. And to clarify, those 2 corridors are 527 and 405?
Actually 3, 527, 524, and 405.
Okay.
And we are getting bus rapid transit on I-405. So that's our closest that we're going to get to light rail, at least in the current plan.
Now, much of the traffic on those corridors, and dare I say most of the traffic on those corridors, comes from outside of this planning area. For instance, you look at 228th, which is not one of the state corridors, and a substantial amount of the traffic is coming from single-family residences outside the area, either east or west of that. And one of the challenges regionally is to get those folks onto buses. Now, it doesn't help on 228th, but it'd help on 405 and 527. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion about increasing park and ride capacity. And I think as you look across this area, virtually all of the park and rides are at capacity fairly early in the morning. It's a challenge to get a space after, fairly early in the morning. One of the park and rides is within this area. Is there any accommodation being made to increase that?
Yeah, we do have in our action alternatives an idea to pursue a public-private partnership to redevelop that park and ride. One, to increase the capacity of the park and ride, but also to create a transit-oriented development right there at the station that connects people into Canyon Park so that you actually have a pleasant walkway into Canyon Park. This idea has come up so much that we have also heard a lot that the PCC area, should it ever redevelop, that should also have a park and ride. The Interagency Technical Transportation Advisory Committee also suggested park and ride there, as well as north of Maltby as well. That's outside of where we're planning too much now, but that's another idea.
And I get that in the planning for this regional growth center, we're not encouraging parking within there because the preference is to have walkable, transit-oriented and such. But I think we need to recognize that stuff goes on outside of that. Mm-hmm. And those people move right through here. There's no way that you're going to divert around this congested area, I'll just say. Yeah. Second, completely different question. When I look at your proposed redevelopment, I see that basically all three of the major food markets in the area are proposed for redevelopment. And, one of the concerns you see in inner cities is food deserts. Mm-hmm. I'd be concerned if we lose the kind of food retail. And I know that a lot of people are getting Safeway or whoever delivered to your door, but still there is a need for those markets. And I'd be concerned if we were moving in a direction that pushed that sort of use out of this area. Because again, then you're making some folks drive a lot further, increasing travel rather than decreasing it.
Yeah. Understood. There are some ways to creatively do infill where you could even keep the strip malls that are there and infill on the parking lots and start to create those main street connections even with what you've already got there. But yeah.
And I would add just experience that I'm seeing in other parts of the region. In West Seattle, where I live, we're seeing redevelopment of grocery stores, and the grocery stores are staying on the ground floor, and they're just putting residential above. So they're tearing everything down, rebuilding. In fact, a PCC market in West Seattle just did that.
Yeah, and Totem Lake is redeveloping with residential, and it's got Whole Foods and a Trader Joe's in there, but. I just want to make the point that that is a use that is essential to the community, and
Definitely.
be sure to accommodate that.
Yep.
I'll be next up in line. Thanks so much for your presentation, and all three of you for everybody for doing all these outreach. I know that's really difficult sometimes, but it's really interesting to hear what the community has to say, and I appreciate that you're actually reaching out. That's very telling of your approach. I have a couple of questions based on what we've just talked about now. The first one being signalization along Bothell Everett Highway. When I was at one of the meetings, there was someone who lives along this stretch or on 214th, and they commented that they had reached out to some traffic people before and commented on signalization. And they had heard back that because the city of Bothell and WashDOT and I guess PUD or somebody, there's just so many different organizations in charge of signalization that synchronization along that corridor is fairly impossible. Is that something that you've looked into as part of the kind of the wider scope of things and in your LOS determination?
Yes, that's a great question. And so, in terms of assumed operations along the corridor in our future year analysis, we are looking at optimizing signal timing and offsets to help that platoon of vehicles proceed through the corridor.
Do you anticipate such signalization changes would result in pretty high differences in level of service, or is that a fairly minor adjustment compared to like what we see right now and what we would anticipate in the no action alternative?
So when it comes to future year conditions, I think it'll certainly help, but part of the problem for this area, as Kevin had mentioned earlier, is that there is a lot of regional traffic that needs to use Bothell Everett Highway or 228th to go through the area, as well as people working within the sub-area trying to get in or out during peak commute hours. So it's certainly helpful. It's just challenging given the constraints and the existing street network that we have here.
I see. The other one about the traffic aspect of this project is the TDM, I think that was the abbreviation, which I understand that to be more behind the scenes modifications with the different uses and different property owners and how businesses kind of conduct their hourly schedules, or whether people can commute in during different situations, or if there's discounted regional transit that's provided for workers. How much resource would the city of Bothell be able to really influence that? I mean, can we use regulations to determine that, or is that just something that we can suggest to businesses? I mean, what does that look like in terms of enforceability?
So I can start, and maybe you guys can follow up. So the state has a CTR program, which is Commute Trip Reduction Program. So any business with, I think it's about 100 or more employees who have to travel during peak hours, that business has to explore different types of travel demand management strategies to encourage their employees not to drive alone to work every day. So things that they could do are subsidized ORCA passes for transit. They can encourage telecommuting so that they don't have to come into the office every day, or they can encourage travel earlier in the day and leave earlier in the day, that type of thing. So when we looked at TDM strategies for this area, we were thinking subsidized transit passes for all employees and residents in the area, some sort of circulator shuttle. So right now we know there are some private businesses that will shuttle employees from the park and ride out to their campus, but we could expand that program and allow everybody in that area to use it. So those types of strategies are what we're looking at to encourage people to get out of their cars, or if they're in their cars, to at least carpool and vanpool. When it comes to the investments that the city of Bothell has for these programs, I think I might just pass it off to you guys to provide more input on that.
Certainly, yes. And we actually do support a van process, and we actually do have staff who are dedicated to assisting some of these companies, particularly businesses, to do this. In fact, one of the things that we just recently had a visit with Juneau, and they're a very major employer out there. They are very excited about transportation demand management. They are very interested. They already do a number of these items just to try and deal with some of these commute issues their people run into every day. And so we actually met with them, as well as community transit. Some of the community transit people, which is our Snohomish County Transit Agency, came in and we met, and they actually got together and they're starting to come up with this whole new strategy of what they can do. So the businesses are very engaged about doing this thing. One of the other companies we went and smoked, well, it was actually Seattle Genetics. They also are looking at some of these options as well. So I think that we have a pretty captive audience out there, and they all recognize that they do have a contribution to make as far as flex schedules, telecommuting, and all those items. So I think that there is a really good opportunity here, and a lot of excitement for doing those things as a way to deal with this transportation issue.
So to answer the other part of your question about can we require this, we look at this through our SEPA process. So we're doing the planned action EIS, so development will be covered in the future, but they would still have to mitigate, and they would have basically a menu, as I understand it, a menu of these things that they could choose from to make sure that they are providing the mitigation. So we wouldn't necessarily require them to provide an ORCA card or require them to have alternative work schedule. They'd be able to select from that menu. They would have to do something.
That's good to know. Is there, because there have been state programs in the recent history that have implemented some transit or transportation demand management strategies, is there data about how much reduction on average, or does that vary wildly and it's just not really worth looking into?
So people who meet that 100 employee threshold, they are required to report how their employees travel to commute to work every year. And so that kind of keeps a record of how things are progressing, and hopefully they're going in the right direction that everybody hopes. And then your other question, I think, was related to
How much change does it actually?
oh, how much change? Yes.
Is it fairly successful, or is it too early to tell? Or?
When we look at potential commute trip reductions for each of these TDM strategies, we are looking at research studies that have been done across the nation and different types of mixed-use locations and business parks. And that type of information is what we used to see what's feasible and implementable in this area. So there is some research to back up what we're showing.
We made an assumption about what the transportation demand management strategies would do in terms of trip reduction.
Yes. So that was included in our mitigated live work analysis, and that menu of strategies that we proposed that resulted something in the range of like 14% reduction in the PM peak hour.
And I mean, obviously the data backs up that type of reduction. Is that fairly conservative assumption, or is that?
The engineer in you is coming.
I'm sorry.
No, that's a great question, because there's always a range of how effective certain things are,
Right.
especially on the location. So when we selected those options, we generally chose the lower end of a more conservative approach, where we chose a lower percentage of reduction for each of those
I see.
items.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. That was probably.
Those are great questions.
This is supposed to be a community dialogue down here. The other questions I had were for you, Rachel. I noticed in the newest action alternative,
The middle ground.
the middle ground alternative, it shows more of a concentration of residential units along State Route 527, which makes sense from a standpoint of access. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. People can get off of the main thoroughfare. We can focus resources on pedestrian improvements along that corridor. But one of the things that I've been thinking about lately and engaging with other communities is during the urban village revitalization of Seattle, there's been some information about how that strategy of focusing growth along narrow corridors has made more of an equity issue in terms of forcing more of the environmental impact of living near highways on residents. And I mean, we don't have the same context as Seattle, but I just want to hear maybe your perspective on what sorts of impacts there are in focusing more residential closer to these transportation. I mean, it's a catch-22, but I want to hear your standpoint.
Yeah, I can start, and Lisa, yeah. So yes, we are looking at that and air quality issues and what the latest guidance on that is. Of course, every source seems to have different numbers. It's actually been an interesting topic to watch over the last few years, and the numbers keep changing, so I don't want to quote a number on what that buffer is that actually is starting to become the norm. So ways of mitigating any residential development that would come along that highway is one first step. And then in terms of the placement of residential itself, this is your night. This is your chance to talk about where we place it. So I think if that's a consideration, let's mark it up on the map and let's get your thoughts on what that right mix of residential and jobs is.
So I can add to Rachel's comments there. WashDOT actually provided some comments during our scoping process about this issue. So we took a closer look at their studies along I-405, for example. We also looked at US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency studies, and there was a sense of needing to set back away from 405 a certain distance. So the way it might play out is the residential might be closer to 228th, for example, if you were on that southern side, and the commercial or office could be closer to the freeway. And those are the kinds of things that are in the qualitatively described in mitigation as something that could be folded into the regulations, for example. There were also some studies we were seeing that promoting green infrastructure can help with local air quality conditions, and that is something that is being proposed for this area. So there's a number of strategies. So I think if we saw direction, be careful in the siting of residential near these major roadways. There are a few different ways to get at that comment.
I see. I was really encouraged by the live work and even the mitigated live work in the distribution of residential, kind of more in, it's not just focused along a narrow band. And this isn't really focused along a narrow band. Well, it kind of is. But, I just, I don't see the same, there's a huge difference between the live work and the potential middle ground in terms of the distribution, as well as residential capacity. And this is just on tangent now, but from my perspective, after talking with members of the community and also just my own thinking about our regional context and growth from more suburban development into a more urban context in this area, planning for the future. I feel like residential capacity is really important in this area, not only because it provides a place for people to live, and we're currently experiencing kind of a crisis there, but it also is probably more economically sound over the course of cyclical periods of economic boom and bust. If we can continue to expect that, I think that we'll see commercial areas be either at capacity or fairly empty, whereas residential, I mean, people need places to live, and regionally are in the Seattle metropolitan area, I know that our the percentage of people who are occupying residential units in multifamily and in mixed-use areas is really high, like above 95%, even though it might not look it from the street. But I think that putting more residential capacity in this area is in line with the council goals and in line with more of what we're looking to do as a city. And so looking at this potential middle ground, it is, it's a big difference between live work, and I think it might make a little bit too much concession to maybe some of the comments that were made by the business community, which is important voice in this discussion too, because they're going to certainly be affected a lot. But I think that this potential middle ground, just the distribution and the percentage tends to be closer to the business park plus than it does to be the live work. And that's something that I'm not super comfortable with, but I'm interested in what other people have to say too. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Quick question, probably a minor issue. Can our current underground utilities handle this growth? Because there's, let's say you've got a 24-inch pipe, now we need a 36-inch pipe. That's a huge undertaking to rip that out and put new stuff in along these major thoroughfares. I'm just curious to see what has been done in that regard.
So in the environmental impact statement, we do address sewer, water, and we have Pertite Engineering supporting us. And from a broader perspective, in terms of the recent interceptor, like the sewer lines, the major lines are sized appropriately from what we understand, and also the treatment capacity. But as this area redevelops, there likely would need to be a closer look at some of the lines, you know, serving particular parcels that would
Where you have
happen.
pump stations and
That would happen at the time of more, you know, finer grain site level review. But there are procedures in place through regular capital planning, and also water and sewer availability.
And who pays for those?
Who pays for?
The upgrades to this water and sewer utilities if needed?
I think the providers pay it, and it does come out in the rates, I think, but, or development sometimes will have to extend. I think there's a combination of what's already been planned in the system that you'd pay into versus what would be your unique impacts, where a developer would have to potentially extend.
Interesting.
We can provide more information on how that process works, but there are procedures in place.
And I'll just add another interesting aspect to that is that the Snohomish County Planned Public Utility District just recently did a major upgrade to its substation within the business park it was about 7 years ago, I think it was, to accommodate a much greater amount of electrical use out there. And so these are some of the things that are kind of being an investment that we're seeing from some of our utility providers in the area. As Lisa identified, the King County Metro, the sewer trunk line that's along 20th Avenue Southeast was a major investment to increase our capacity on sanitary sewer treatment. So there have been a lot of those kind of investments, but I think that that's one of the things that we want to make sure that we address as a part of our environmental review.
So a couple of varied questions. Very specifically in transportation, I see that the 20th Avenue connection is recommended, and the 23rd was the big gray dot saying no way. So what were the conditions that led to that? I confess I haven't walked back there. I'm not that familiar with the topography, but why is one?
Well, I can identify the 23rd Avenue to the actually north and south, both go through some very major wetland areas. Particularly the one to the north, that is a very large wetland area. Behind the Fred Meyer, the 20th Avenue kind of area, that's also a major wetland. But the complication for 23rd is it also goes through a residential area as well. And that's always a tough thing to go through, particularly if you've got, you know, a residential area that is used to not seeing a lot of that traffic. And some of the other aspects that we looked at, and we actually kind of looked at maybe another one, which is over toward 30th Avenue, but it just, you know, the idea is if you're going to do that type of a capital project, which is really expensive, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars, you want it to be really effective. And the most effective ones, and I'm going to speak out of turn probably because Carmen will probably correct me, is that behind Fred Meyer and 214th were identified as really effective mechanisms to get transportation onto some of the surrounding street grids.
And again, the wetland that 23rd going north through is a significant one.
Well,
Kind of behind. That's behind the public works.
It is,
yard,
yeah,
isn't it?
and it's a pretty good wetland. There's also an area that's a created wetland that's kind of a combination of a wetland and a surface water facility. So those are all some of the things that we're gonna have to evaluate as we go through this process. But yeah, you've identified the real conundrum, which is really not good choices
Yeah.
For where we go.
Okay. Earlier on in this process, we heard from Sound Transit about their operating base. Any comment on status there?
I'll start and then Michael will finish for me. Okay. I get all worked up when I talk. Fair enough. Yeah, it's an issue, and it's an issue because it is 12.5 acres of vacant, very developable piece of property right in the middle of our regional growth center. And we've had this conversation before. It has an impact on us. And one of the things that we're having to do right now is have discussions is what those impacts are. And that's a continuing discussion. We're gonna have to come up with something that gets us whole, I guess is the way I would identify it. And, there's maybe some options we can investigate, but it's a tough challenge.
There was a kind of passing reference to green infrastructure. I don't know, one of David's interests was advocating for the green infrastructure, the solar and other aspects, stormwater handling as well. How far will this process go into either recommending or requiring or that sort of, those sorts of improvements?
I'll start on surface water because I'm somewhat familiar with it. Surface water, of course, is a provision that we have to follow underneath state guidelines, the Department of Ecology specifically. And one of the things that's going to be interesting is that as this area redevelops, they're going to have to comply with those new state ecology standards.
Which I'd expect they don't.
And they probably don't now. This is a mid-'80s to early '90s business park, and they were operating underneath. You remember the old? You're an engineer. You know steel.
I designed some of those old standards, so yes.
So, so that'll be one of the things that will have to happen here. Now, one of the comments we got in the draft environmental impact statement was, well, what kind of impact does that have on development capacity? And it's hard to say because there's so many options underneath the state standards, the ecology standards for addressing surface water. But there will certainly have to be a much improved style of surface water retention, detention. I don't know if you'd be able to retain it because it's really super high water table. But anyway, so all those things are going to have to be discussed as we go through redevelopment. You guys want to finish up for me?
I think you covered it. I think the EIS did show that was one of the positive effects of changes in the area over time would be improved water quality, and that's been borne out in other, regional urban areas as well. But I think Bruce handled all the challenges.
And just one thing I would add that's come up recently in some internal discussions, and I don't know if this has been conveyed to the consultant team yet, looking at purple pipe in that area for the reusable water to provide for landscaping, irrigation, that type of thing. So that would be another type of green infrastructure that could be incorporated into future development.
With the source being Brightwater?
I believe so.
Yeah, yes, I know one of the things that when Brightwater first came in a number of years ago, they actually did talk about using a lot of this purple or this reuse, water within. Willows Golf Course was a classic example of that and what they could do in that area. So that's a continuing discussion. I know. I haven't updated myself recently, but I know that was a real part of their plan.
And finally, I'd like to second Carson's comment about the potential middle ground versus the live-work. And it does seem like some of the more desirable residential areas near North Creek are taken out of the residential. I hear that the business community expressed a concern about loss of business capacity. So, we need to respect that and respond to that. But boy, if I was going to pick a place in that whole area that I wanted to live, it'd be near the creek. And, you've kind of taken that off the table on this. So, yeah.
Am I reading those colors right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just making sure I'm reading the colors correctly. So, okay. Yeah, pinks in particular are tough.
Amount of residential desired. You're welcome. Mark it if you-
Go for it.
You've done well.
Yeah.
And that would also mitigate these people's issues unless, I'm sure they wouldn't like high-density residential, but, that's a really pretty area through here.
Is this the site where the school is coming in?
Yes.
And this is definitely a floodway. It was underwater earlier this year.
It is most definitely a flood. Certainly, but I think, actually, you're right, I think it's a floodway.
In spite of the owner's occasional channelization.
Didn't seem to make any difference, does it?
Rises out of the channel.
No, it does not.
One of the, I'll just piggyback off that comment, because one of the things that I heard in the meeting from some of the residents and some of the people that are interested but don't live in this sub-area was potential for using these frequently flooded areas when they're not flooded. I think that the discussion was leading towards a dog park, but that's probably not great in a sensitive wetland.
No.
But has there been any exploration in using areas? I know, like globally, so there's might not be a context in America for this, but globally there's examples of using frequently flooded areas as, natural space that's open to the public rather than, a fenced-off wetland. Or it appears to be a grass field in the summer, but have you looked into that anymore, or?
We were just talking about that happening over in Pittsburgh County. We can look more into it. There are coming online some local examples of those types of flooded areas and usable area when they're not flooded, but allowing for flooding.
Cool, yeah, that'd be good.
I think that King County and other places have allowed it in terms of stormwater infrastructure. So during dry times, there would be a play area for what would otherwise during the wet season be a stormwater facility. So I could imagine that being the case also for natural flood areas.
I'm recalling long ago seeing a presentation on a percent for earthworks in a stormwater facility that was submerged during certain times, and then during the dry periods it was used. And it also said that it's fairly well known among many dog owners that is an informal off-leash dog area. Look when you drive by.
You're correct.
I just want to pick up on something on Kevin said earlier. I do think I'd like to see in the future a requirement for solar arrays on any new construction in the area above a certain height, maybe. Maybe that would be a way to kind of lessen the blow to maybe structures that are smaller in size and lower in height, but I don't see why there's any reason in this day and age we're not requiring something like that, because we need to be starting to generate some of our own power as a city to offset what we're using. Bruce.
Oh, I was just gonna say, when you say a certain height, are you talking about the development, the building a certain height, or the solar facility a certain height?
The building.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that's one clarification. So, but I'm not going to go on that. You guys already know how I feel on that. As well as car charging stations, I'd like to get out in front of the market on that. I don't feel like the market's quite keeping up with that. And also with regard, going back to Commissioner Kiernan's point earlier with regards to the park and ride. I still think, and I don't know, maybe I'll just like go over there late at night a couple times. I don't know what kind of, because I know there's like a limited capacity there, and I'm curious as to know like how often it's checked in on. Like, is there potential that people might be parked there longer than a certain amount of time than they need to be? I guess maybe for a couple days, 3 days at a time. I don't know, but I've just always been curious about it. I don't know if you have to, how that is done, but if it's between making sure that we're making sure people park their cars and get it within 24 hours and leave and then come back, I think that would be preferable, because I know it's very expensive to build these parking structures. And so I don't know. I know we want to encourage people to park there, but also if we're at capacity, you have to either build more structures or more capacity, or you need to change how the capacity is used.
And that's something we can talk to Community Transit about. The facility is owned by WashDOT, but it's managed by Community Transit. So
Okay.
I don't know if they do enforcement or monitoring of any kind, but it's a good question, and that's probably something for the ITAC.
Yes.
You could bring up when
Maybe
when we meet with them.
creating
Transit
or
folks.
trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, as they say. But it would be interesting to know. Yeah.
Yeah, some of the issue is that, of course, these parking rides are becoming 24-hour operations. I've been to a couple parking rides late at night, and it's like, gosh, look at all these cars. What are these people doing? Well, they're doing those flex schedules. But yeah, it's so that's an interesting question.
And I know Sound Transit is moving towards charging for parking in some of their facilities. They've done a pilot program, and they're looking at, not for all spaces, but charging, if you want to guarantee, I guess, that a space, then you can subscribe. But they're looking at expanding that, and I think Metro is also considering something similar to that.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, it must be really frustrating. I'm not a person who has to do this, but if you need to use that and you go and it's full, and you're like, oh, what do I do now? I guess I sit in traffic. If you're kind of depending on that, it'd be nice to have more assurance that 90% of the time it's going to be there or whatever. So.
Much more of an issue downtown. Much more of an issue downtown with the residential development around and people parking.
So I want to make sure that we're getting to some of the questions that you have in the agenda memo. I want to make sure that we're getting direction to other questions that we have for the commission as well.
I'd like to hear more about the land use mix. If we could confirm direction on some pieces or questions on other pieces.
I would like to join Commissioner Kiernan and Commissioner Curd with regards to more residential in certain areas that, I guess not that one, but the other one, the live work, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm much more amenable to this live work, because I just feel like residential and business has to be able to coexist. It just seems like it create more of a dynamic setting. And I know there's certain manufacturing sectors that it wouldn't work for, but I don't know, it just seems like it would create more of an active place.
Okay. Part of that discussion too goes along with creating these public gathering spaces. That's really important in these residential mixed-use areas. I feel like that is going to make or break regional development in the long term. We can create residential spaces along these desirable natural pathways or the water courses, but it's the built environment that really draws people in, especially demographics that are interested in employment opportunities in the Regional Growth Center, which is probably partly the aim here in reducing traffic impacts. So I feel like we can't forget about these public gathering spaces too when we're thinking about which parts of the region here need to be residential. And so I was really encouraged looking at this live work, or even the mitigated live work, showing proposed pedestrian improvements across Interstate 405, connecting to potentially the park and ride from not the interchange. And that was encouraging because connecting these residential areas might also be important. So when I'm going to be looking at evaluating these plans as they develop further, I'm looking for residential connectivity as well. So not just isolated patches of residential areas. That might work more for the businesses, whereas in your live work pattern here, it shows the Juneau development being kind of an isolated patch of commercial mixed use. That doesn't necessarily, I understand that it doesn't necessarily mean it's just going to be them all alone out there, but looking at connectivity is going to be important just for creating regional pathways that people can take and interact with each other. I think that creating these people places are important.
Today and other future, or what's the impact on the schools? So I know that there's the buses are stored here. What's that do to getting the buses out and you bring the buses home? How does that impact? Because my boys take buses to school. You mentioned there's a school being built in here, or there's a school already there?
Yeah, the North Shore School District recently acquired a property in the Canyon Park Business Center to use as some kind of a special scientific school, high school. Yeah, kind of like a magnet school, but emphasis on STEM
programs,
and
okay.
those kind of things. Yes.
But I'm curious to see which of these options school district have they endorsed any of these? Have they not? Being they have.
They've written a comment letter on the draft, and their concern was, one, making sure that all of their acquisitions are shown on the map, including the most recent. We did analyze, using their student generation rates, how many students there would be under the different options and what that might mean to already, crowded schools. So they have a concern about, ensuring that those impacts are addressed. But I don't know that I don't think they endorsed a particular alternative so far.
I don't think so.
Yeah, they had a very specific comment, at least excerpted in our packet, about 20th Avenue.
There is a school there. I forgot which one it is. Did it say which one?
Yeah, actually, I think
Crystal Springs, okay.
I think my recollection is their concern was more along the operation of their bus facility and whether that connection to the north would impact their ability to come in and out of their facility in that location.
Yeah, from a safety standpoint, these kids get up early in the morning, it's dark. And if they're waiting, that's a huge issue. If they're waiting for a bus or if they're behind schedule.
It probably would, but that'll be something that we'll have a little more discussion about.
I almost hesitate to say this, but one of the ways to look at this is to consider it as being less worse than it would be otherwise. Because keep in mind, when we talk about the no action alternative, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't do anything. It means that we would go with the current plan. And even under the current plan, we would have all of the traffic issues that we're talking about under these other alternatives as well.
I'm looking at which option sucks the least.
Yeah, well, that's one way to look at it, frankly, yes.
They're all going to be impactful one way or another. It's which one has the least amount of impact.
And the inclusion of these connections, and this is something that we spent a lot of time talking about and agonizing over, and having Carmen and her folks analyze whether there would be enough of a benefit to those connections, because we know they're going to be difficult for a lot of different reasons. But that's why we're including those in the potential mitigation, because they do make a significant enough difference in terms of, again, less worse than it would be without those, but also to provide those additional connections. And they're not just automobile connections, because there would be pedestrian facilities along, and probably bike facilities, at least a couple of those, I would presume. So we're looking at it in the greater context in that sense. You know, I was promised those by my third grade teacher. I am still waiting for them.
Let me flip to the specific questions. I know there was one about setting up a tiered system and triggers, and as we grow, what do you need to wait for? So number 5 is kind of a complex one.
Phasing.
Yeah, should a phasing program where growth, infrastructure, functionality, and livability are connected be considered? And what mitigation and timing could we consider? So a little bit on that, just knowing that when 1,000 more people come here, that's already gonna be so much growth that certain things move to LOSF, and don't quote me on any of this. And we can go back and look at the numbers later. But anyways, we know that with just a little bit more growth, certain things start to fail. So then what do we do?
Excuse me, could you speak into the mic, please?
Oh,
Sure.
sorry.
Yeah, so we know that with a certain amount of new growth, not even all the growth that we're expecting, certain things start to fail. So that could be one of our phases. We say, okay, up to this level of growth, we will allow the growth and even encourage the growth. But once we get there, then we have to wait, catch up until mitigation projects come online. We get the funding for them or whatever it is that we need to wait for. So is some kind of phasing or set of tiers and triggers, does that kind of thing make sense to you all? And what kind of considerations or questions would you have for us about that?
I understand why phasing would be an idea that we should look at, and it makes sense from a logistics standpoint, but I can envision us putting forward a phasing process and then reaching our maximum and having these weird isolated pockets of density and it really falling back on the city and the planning and it falling back on us in the public perception of following through with goals. And so while I understand phasing could be an option, I would recommend going forward with, if a phasing plan is needed, going forward with it in pretty minor steps. And I don't know how effective that would be at that resolution. So that's my perspective. Other people might have different, but.
Could you elaborate what you mean by minor steps? I'm not sure I grasped that.
So instead of phasing where we would just, cut off development, maybe saying once we're approaching these lower limits, we start putting a gradient on development before infrastructure. And so just finding a balance between the threshold levels of development before pulling the plug, I guess.
And are we talking about phasing because we are just wanting to make sure that we are being compensated by the impacts that we're taking on as a city to help out with our infrastructure? Is that why we're talking about phasing? Or is that one of the reasons? Or is that the reason?
Generally, yeah, that would be the concept would be,
Okay.
let's make sure our infrastructure keeps up with our transportation demand. Not sure it would work, but we just wanted to pose the question to the commission to see if that was something you were interested in exploring. I'm not seeing a lot of conviction there.
Well, I do think we should explore that. I don't think we've done a very good job regionally keeping up with growth. And the infrastructure is always lagging behind, and sometimes it's very far behind. And that's a complaint you hear from people generally, that, you get all the growth, how are you managing it? The example would be schools. You're always seeing kids in portables. The buildings aren't ready when the kids come in. And we have to try to do a better job, in my opinion, if not, I don't think we'll ever get out ahead of it, But to come closer to concurrency, I think would be important.
I guess with phasing, I just wouldn't want to. At the same time, I guess the only reason I'd hesitate, because it sounds like kind of like a good approach to me, but I wouldn't want it to. I mean, you've been working on this. I mean, it's like I wouldn't want a lot of this work that's gone into all of this outreach has gone into place to kind of like, oh well, let's try to. I mean, is there a way that we can do a phased approach that doesn't inhibit like a lot of the work, basically shelve a lot of the work that we've done?
And that is a challenge. And
Okay.
coming up with that, what are those thresholds? What are an equitable threshold is really difficult. We're thinking about some of the regional approaches, what some of the jurisdictions have done, and I think it's been a mixed bag, honestly. I think that you could look at some place like Sammamish and say, well, it wasn't really necessarily a good idea because as you identified, they just cut right off and that's it. Burien did a little bit more work on that aspect. It was a little bit better, but it's tough. And I just posed
That's
this
tough.
question just to see if the commission wanted us to even spend any time on this. And so as I'm kind of seeing yes, maybe no, maybe yes, maybe no.
Well, when I look at the potential mitigation project list, I wrote on the top of it funding. I mean,
There you go.
there's, particularly in the current environment with 976 hitting transportation funding, I don't know where the money's going to come from.
How many regional growth centers do we compete against? 10, 20, 15
There are currently 29 regional growth centers.
in the
There's-
4-county
in
area?
the 4-county area, and 10 manufacturing industrial centers that also
If you all could describe, if you all could describe your ideal way that you would see this evolve into a different neighborhood, like where would something start and what would that storyline be? That would help me understand if there is kind of a phasing that might make sense.
I think slow and steady is going to win the race. This isn't a sprint, If we're going to have to get here, I think you have to do it a little bit at a time.
So piecemeal throughout, whatever comes, comes.
What's the market saying? No, seriously, is there a strong residential demand? We're seeing a lot of apartments in the downtown area. Does that also apply up here? You said you heard from the business community concern about being frozen out. I'm not sure that's exactly what you said. But is there pent-up demand for more business space, or are they just looking to grow? I mean, if a blank parcel was put out there, do what you want on it right now, where would the demand be?
The demand is generally residential, as we're seeing residential come in, although we are seeing a lot of tenant improvements with the jobs as well. I don't know, do we want to speak to draft pro forma analysis?
We will be bringing forward a market study that compiles a lot of what's already been done, plus additional information. And we have done some pro forma analysis and looking at some of the regulations and how that would work on the ground. And Rachel kind of highlighted the residential is viable. The ability to add to space by existing owners is good, and the city's seeing that both in internal tenant improvements and then potential infill. And the new, like, total redevelopment, that's where I think it's a little trickier. A lot of this revolves around the parking standards and the form of parking. And so we will be bringing that forward over the next few weeks as we also start to get into the preferred alternative and the regulations that go with it, and how does that work to make this development pattern viable.
And just to add, we are, certainly the market is a factor, and, we're taking a look at that, but the purpose of the plan is to make sure that we're putting something in place, putting the guidelines in place for trying to get the market to develop what we're looking for long-term, the vision for this area. So if we just went with what the market is developing right now, we'd see a lot of townhouse development in this area. That, from a residential standpoint, that's really the hot market at the moment. That doesn't mean that's what we're going to see long-term, certainly, and we may end up with townhouse development in areas where we really wouldn't want that long-term. So we're trying to put some things in place that are going to leverage the market, but in ways that are in line with what we're trying to achieve in the area. So the examples are, we've got a project that's under development right now, just east of Romac, that's townhouse. It's below the 45 activity units per acre that we need. It's one of the reasons we looked at we're proposing the minimum density requirements for this area and for North Creek as well. The site of the Sound Transit bus facility, the 12.5 acres just north of Romac, also had losing my ability to speak all of a sudden, a townhouse project in process. I mean, we were working toward permitting that as well, because that's where the demand is right now. Again, below the levels that we would want to see. The other large vacant parcel is the teacher's investment property. Yes, that's it. And that was an office proposal 15 years ago that didn't happen. Now we're looking at multifamily development on that site. So those are probably the three largest vacant available parcels in the park. The apartments would not be. The townhouse developments would be. The bus barn certainly is, and that's the reason we're having the discussions with Sound Transit. So what we're looking at in terms of the potential for really redevelopment in this area, I think, and I think that we'll see if the market study bears this out, is really redevelopment in a lot of those surface parking areas. Because where we're seeing the demand for additional employment is what Rachel was saying, that the tenant improvements. We've added, what is it, Bruce, about 3,500 jobs in the last 5 years?
Absolutely.
With no new buildings. So that's where we're seeing the opportunity for that type of growth. So just to put that out there as additional information as we're talking about how much more residential do you want and where would you like to see it? I think that's kind of what Rachel's looking for. And then as far as phasing, it could be more of a geographic type of phasing as well in terms of where we would put our capital investments. If we want to encourage more residential in certain areas and that needs some infrastructure improvements, we might make those investments first. So there are different ways that we can approach that as well.
The way that I envision this kind of coming to fruition would be through this incremental changes and incremental development of new structures on existing parcels. But also, I think that the city can do two things. One is, like, the very obvious thing would be reduce parking. That's why we're getting townhomes, and that's strangling all the development potential for this area. Especially if we have investment in public transit, we need to leverage that, and I think that it's irresponsible not to. So reducing parking minimums or inserting parking maximums would be important. The other thing is to start putting seeds of urbanism in areas that we are looking maybe a little bit heavier of a lift in terms of redevelopment, which would be PCC area, which would also be up north on the northern central end of the sub area as well. I don't know how extensive the city does not have budget for putting in a plaza or anything, but partnering with developers who show interest early on could be one way to do that. Working in terms of putting visioning documents together, rallying community support around what they'd like to see, and involving the community in the planning process could backfire if it doesn't come to fruition, but involving them and getting the community excited about public spaces could potentially start seeds of urbanism in this area. So that's what I envision, but ultimately I think it will be a slow and long process to getting towards the numbers we need to see. Hopefully with reduction of parking, that will happen at a faster rate, but we don't really have a lot of history in this city of reducing parking. So we'll see how that plays out in the local market.
Could I get, oh, go ahead.
Oh, so we didn't really answer your phased approach thing, did we,
No,
Bruce?
we got some ideas.
Yeah, okay, great.
Could we get confirmation that the reduced boundary made sense to aim for less growth?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good.
All right.
Done. Check.
We've been
Yeah,
talking about the right,
that.
we've been talking about the right mix, and it seems like we're looking at a little bit higher residential mix than what is kind of depicted on the map. So that's a good thing for us to take away as well. That's interesting. Is there something else we should be looking at that the commission might say, hey, what about this mixture? Or what about this area? Maybe you could look at these areas in a little bit different way. If there's something that we haven't kind of thought about yet that you would like us to explore.
I'm wondering about potential, well, I'm noticing it now that on the eastern portion of the sub area, there's this residential buffer, but I'm wondering about pushback from the community currently along 9th Avenue in that corridor. If there is considerable opposition to changing the zoning of this area in the nearby vicinity, or if that's something that could be an issue with potential pedestrian connections, if that's the reasoning behind not installing existing east-west or new east-west corridors. Is that clear? Like
The land use changes, is that also playing into the 9th Ave lack of desire for the 214th connection?
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't hear that. I didn't hear people making that connection between the zoning playing into that 214th connection.
Okay.
It was mostly just this is our private property. There are a lot of access issues. There's a school nearby. There safety of kids walking around the area. I think any general growth, any additional cars was what they were worried about, particularly speeding, which actually might reduce as there are more cars.
I see. Yeah, I was just commenting on that because I think that in terms of public support for this regional growth center kind of taking on a new habit, there's a lot of benefit in communicating to concerned residents of other areas and of other neighborhoods that this is meant to protect what they consider to be their assets. And so by focusing this growth in this area, we're not only helping this to be our citywide economic engine, but also we're preserving natural spaces elsewhere, and we're really approaching this in a detailed and thoughtful way. I think that goes a long way in not necessarily convincing people, but bringing forward some of the actual, the realistic costs to development in general. Like, yeah.
Thank you.
So as I look at the last 4, those all really seem to fall under transportation mitigation in some form or another. So based on earlier discussion, I'm going to throw something out and tell me if I've missed the mark here. At this point, it sounds like the commission is not taking anything off the table as far as the potential mitigation that's been identified. Is that a fair statement? Is there anything you would want to add to that? To that list that's on the back of the, well, these are projects, that's not necessarily all the other mitigation options, so it's a pretty comprehensive list right now, as I recall.
Although I would express a concern that the final option there, modifying the city's level of service standard, is almost I'll just say cop-out and not do the capital improvements and just say, we'll live with it. And that does seem to provide an easy out, particularly given none of the improvements are going to be easy. None of them are going to be find simple funding. So I just hate to put out there that as a first choice rather than a last choice.
Okay.
That's why it's number 10.
Yeah, understood. And modify doesn't necessarily mean lowering our level of service standard either. It could also mean changing how we calculate that. Because I know other cities, and this is something I think we've been looking at, they put more of an emphasis on non-SOV trips. So you get, basically you get better credit for good transit or HOV or even non-motorized, as that becomes part of that level of service calculation. And I don't think we do that right now in our LOS. I think it's really based on automobile trips.
It does, yes.
A plan to put high occupancy vehicle lanes going to and from the area onto 405?
Onto 405? Or
Yeah, I know
on
there's
405?
On 405, yes.
but to get off and then come over into it to where if you're an HOV, you can bypass all this and get on that way. Direct access ramps.
That's one specific ramp. I know we talked about bat lanes, but if we talked about
Tolling.
HOV lanes on, you're talking about on 527, for example, or?
Yeah, that connect the Canyon Park area directly to 405.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is a WashDOT project to build express toll ramps from 17th Avenue here to the Park and Ride, and then you would be able to get onto the toll lane.
Yeah, that's one of the projects that WashDOT is actually working with the city now on, is certainly adding an additional express toll lane on 405 from 522 up to 527, and then this on-off ramp right here from those express toll lanes. This is going to also carry the bus rapid transit facilities that Sound Transit is constructing as part of Sound Transit number 3.
Just to close out my opinions on the last 4 statements, something that you brought up, Bruce, during one of the many public comment periods was, I forget which one, but you commented about moving people. And that just resounds really deeply, because if we're looking to increase the amount of people, we should be calculating how many people we're moving, not how many cars, because I have a growing sense of urgency personally about reducing my own car dependency. And I feel like that's not just me. I feel like as a culture, we might be moving away eventually, hopefully. And so really investing in alternative transportation can go a long way if it's connected to a network. And so I'm excited for maybe how the bike master plan will coordinate with these plans. And I think that's one thing that I haven't seen yet, because it probably hasn't really been done yet. But I think that's going to be an important aspect of this.
I think there's been a reluctance in this region as far as mass transit to have people have to transfer. You want to get on a bus where you start and you want to get off at your destination. And that's not the way it is everywhere else. If you have frequent connections, that's less of an issue. And we really don't have that here. If you're coming out from any distance, I mean, there aren't buses that go down 228. There's all kinds of residential development east and west up 228th, but you're not going to get down into these transit centers without driving. And given those hills, people aren't biking them. I mean, I've tried, I've done it. Yeah, electric bikes maybe, e-bikes, yeah,
yes.
but I think you got a long way to go before those significant developments, which continue to be placed in there, move off of the dependency, unless you can get some kind of shuttle, some kind of frequent and convenient transportation.
Bouncing off of that, this is personal anecdote, so it doesn't mean anything, but I've been more intentional when I've been moving through this area recently and noticing how people move. And it's surprising and perplexing the amount of pedestrians I see walking along the Bothell Everett Highway between Fred Meyer and the Park and Ride. I have no idea why they're walking on that road. It's not a very pedestrian oriented at all. Pavement isn't in really great condition. Like, there's so many things against people using that corridor for anything other than automobile, but it's happening now. And I don't know if we have a good count on pedestrians, and it's hard to measure, but I think we might be surprised at how, at actually looking at data for that. So yeah, it's interesting.
Did we get enough direction on the questions?
I think so for now. What do you think, Bruce?
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty confident.
Yeah, let us know if there's any particular question you're still confused about, and we have a few minutes here to do that, so.
And I think one of the main things, we wanted to make sure if there's any other information, we've heard several questions tonight that we'll get some additional work done on. But if there's any other information, this is not your last shot at this. And maybe you want to touch a little bit on the schedule at this point and what the future opportunities are going to be for the Planning Commission to have input.
And one real quick question in my mind, I don't know if we need to touch on it more next time, but I don't have a real good feel on, we have this great waterway going through right through the middle of all we're talking about. And so I don't have a really good idea of how that looks with regards to North Creek.
Oh, okay, thank you.
How we would treat that in terms of?
Yeah, like it's an active space, also as a great wildlife corridor. What does it look like? Maybe if I'd have gone to some of these meetings, maybe I'd know better. I did go to one. It was so long ago. So, but yeah, I think that's a really great connector there. I mean, it's just the Centennial Park all the way through it's a great opportunity, and I guess we haven't touched on it tonight, so I'd love to touch on it next time.
Yeah, we haven't neglected it. We've had a lot of discussions about that as well.
Sure.
But that's a good question. We haven't really talked much about it with the commission.
And is there anything else that the commission would like to get from us that'll help you as we go through this?
Well, one comment I may make, maybe following on Commissioner Curd's comment, when we look at pedestrian improvements, the way things currently work, when there's development, they improve their frontage. And the result is we get this checkerboard. And I personally walked up and down 15th and 19th, and you get a sidewalk and it'll end. And then there's a sidewalk on the other side of the street, and there's really no connectivity. And I get that the interest is, so going from that specific to the more general, I get the interest is having, when a developer makes a development, that they make frontage improvements, but can those be banked into a more connected system rather than have these little segments that maybe someday in the distant future will be connected? Because right now we have some, and I'll just say flat out dangerous circumstances.
Yeah.
Where if you're walking and you got to get to the sidewalk and there's bad sight distances and it's,
Phasing.
yeah, well.
there are different schools of thought about that. We can have that discussion with the commission at some point in the
Yes.
future and have some public works folks here to talk about that too.
Be a good topic.
Yeah, but it is a challenge. You're right.
I understand how we got here, but boy.
Are there some of those situations within Canyon Park that you want to point out to us? Just in case we do go towards this phasing, just understanding, really connecting this route makes a lot of sense before we reach gross there.
I've done more walking to the south. I've actually walked from the park and ride up this way. And, the crossing, you get the bridge, but then getting from there to there is real challenging and real circuitous. And 228th is not bad, but then when you start going north, it's just fragmented. And the city has had work going on 19th that I've talked a little bit to the Public Works Director about. And I understand there have been some challenges there, but, these are not, 19th is getting better. 15th, if you look at that, it's just a checkerboard of sidewalks here, there, and everywhere, and it's not connected.
I'd say the road just north, I don't know the numbers, the road just north of the park and ride in towards 17th, that'd be 17th Avenue Southeast.
Yes.
Is, there are sidewalks, if you can call them that, but they're in various states of disrepair. And it would be dangerous to roll a wheelchair or not so.
Yeah, and actually, I can give you a ray of hope on that. One of the elements of the park and ride, the WashDOT 17th Avenue off-ramp is to rebuild 17th Avenue up to 220th and to the west.
That's
And
great.
so that will take care of that segment, but as you identified, there are segments of the east that still need to be addressed.
Right, and I would imagine, to the north as well, just throughout the development, it's varying states of repair, so.
So we're getting really close to your maximum time limit. And I just wanted to touch real quickly, we're going to have another study session on February the 19th with the commission. And the idea behind it is to bring all this data you've given us and some of the additional work we're going to provide, and we're going to come back to you and have another discussion like this before we do our first public hearing, which right now we're trying to set up for March 1st.
Okay, because on our little agenda thing, it says it's a public hearing.
It does
We'll
say
change
public
that. Okay,
hearing.
great.
We're going to make that a study session. We think that we want to take enough time with the commission to really get a feel for the commission so the commission can get up to speed on this huge project.
And then Bruce, for the public hearing, do you anticipate getting a recommendation that evening as well?
We might give them another chance.
Okay.
I think what'll happen at the public hearing, you're going to get a lot of feedback from a lot of different folks. And that'll be a really important topic for us to do. And I guess in theory, maybe might be able to do it in one evening, but.
And keep in mind, this is just on the preferred alternative.
Yeah,
So
we're not.
That's what sets us up then to do the final sub-area plan and the final draft of the sub-area plan, I should say, and the final EIS that would then come forward. And certainly the plan is going to come back to you along with the development regulations. So, and when we do that 19th study session, we'll have an updated schedule.
Yes,
and we can talk to you some more about that.
Yeah, and we've been kind of working on that a little bit right now based upon some of the new information we've been trying to gather as well.
This is a big puzzle with a lot of pieces, and we're still trying to fit them all together in terms of our schedule and work program, so.
Yeah, it's a puzzle called The Snowman in the Snow.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. That was a very worthwhile time. I definitely understand a lot more about the project and about the process, and thanks for all the input you're taking from us and for all you're doing out there for the city of Bothell. There's not any old business tonight, I don't believe. Oh, you do
I
have a
have a question.
Yes.
We discussed at the last meeting drafting something to the council supporting.
I have not drafted that letter.
backfilling.
Yeah.
Should we perhaps have a motion, or do we still have time to do that? Is that time sensitive?
The docket discussion at the council will be on February 4th.
Well, the issue would be to
right.
support that they accelerate the hiring of someone to backfill Bruce's position while he's still here, so that there can be some transfer of knowledge given the regional significance of this project.
And as we talked about at the last meeting, if the commission would like to do that, that's certainly within your purview to do that. But that's entirely up to you, and the effort would have to come entirely from you. There would be,
No, I
we wouldn't be able to
understand
do any
that.
staff work on that.
Sure, I understand that, some sensitivity around that. My question to you was around the timing of it.
Yeah.
At what point will we have waited too long to be effective?
February 4th will be the council date, so it would need to get to them by February
Okay.
4th.
And we don't meet again until the 5th?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
yeah.
Could we perhaps craft a motion?
Yeah.
Would that?
Yes, that would be one way that you could convey that.
So I would move that the planning commission supports hiring an individual to backfill, I'm not sure that's the right word, but to backfill Bruce's position while he is still, prior to his retirement, so that they may work together and he can transfer some of his extensive knowledge on these very complex projects he's been working on before he leaves. Probably could be more
Second.
articulately worded.
I guess I don't know if I should be seconding that.
I second.
Okay,
We can have a discussion on the motion now.
yes. Is there any discussion on the motion?
Could you read back what I moved so that I could, well,
I'm still writing it, but yes,
Okay.
I think I've got it. So that the planning commission supports filling Bruce's position before retirement to provide for
overlap,
Transfer of knowledge.
overlap
so that there may
and
be a
transfer of knowledge.
Other than a brain set of things. Yeah,
For-
we
yeah.
don't do that.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. I heard something along the lines of about transition, smoother
Yeah,
transition, or
prior to his departure, so that there can be a smoother transition.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So here's what I've jotted down. Whoops, missed a word. Planning Commission supports filling Bruce's position before retirement to provide for overlap and transfer of knowledge for smoother transition. A smoother transition.
All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Is there more?
Oh, I guess we're-
is there
sorry,
more
we're
You're still
discussing.
in discussion, yes.
Sorry, I'm like, I don't feel like under the gun. I guess we could extend the meeting. I'm trying to figure out how to get everything through. But yeah, is there some discussion on the motion?
Are we still crafting a memorandum or a letter?
I think it'd be too late at this point.
Okay.
That was the question that I asked, and apparently the council is acting before our next meeting.
Yeah.
So if we want to get our thoughts before the council, I think we have to act tonight. And I think this is the vehicle to do that. I'm certainly open to any
Could-
other
if-
suggestions.
This is one way you could. if you
Could somebody
want-
craft, should one person here maybe craft it? Would there be a way to send it out to the commission as long as we don't have a discussion about it and send back our opinion on what person wrote?
So because we have to be careful with the OPMA.
Yeah, for sure.
There are a couple of methods that come to mind. One is you could just do it through the motion, so these would appear in the minutes. We could make sure those get conveyed to the city council, if that's the direction of the planning commission. The other option is you could use this to direct the chair to craft a letter on behalf of the planning commission. That would get around, we wouldn't have to worry about a serial meeting or anything like that. Then you've given specific direction to the chair to draft a letter based on this motion that he could then prepare and send to the council ahead of that date. That's another option. Those are the two that come to mind. So whichever.
And could I conceivably talk to another person, or I mean, I'm fine with crafting that up, should I be given the permission to do so, but I could also, if people were more comfortable, I could work with another commissioner as well.
As long as it was no more than, I'd say, one
Exactly.
other commissioner, just to be safe.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah. You could direct two people to work on the letter
right.
if you wanted to do that, ask for volunteers or something along that line.
Are there two people here who would like to work on a letter? I mean, so we're discussing it, so. I mean, I'd be happy to work on it, but if there's other people who prefer to work on it, I'm open to that as well.
Here, use this one.
They shut me down at 9. I'm happy to help if need be.
Okay, so I could work on it with Brad then? Okay, all right, so,
If that's the direction of the commission, if you want to make that part of your motion.
Would it be more impactful to provide public comment at the city council meeting instead?
and I would also, oh, sorry, that's what I was going to say. Thank you for I would also provide public comment at the time, along with the letter, to be there in person, or, I mean, we could have as many of us, well, 3 of us there at least.
Yeah, because I would certainly be willing to provide public comment, but I don't know, I don't have time to craft a letter and I don't want to seem like I'm shoving work off onto you, so.
No, no worry. Okay. So we have the motion, and the discussion is that myself and Commissioner Pystrup craft the letter?
You'd have to amend the motion to provide that direction.
Okay, oh, that's true.
So can I amend my own motion?
Yes.
So I would amend my motion that we direct the chair and Commissioner Pystrup to craft a letter to the council consistent with the remaining substance of my motion, previous motion.
Is there discussion on,
Is the Commissioner Kurd as the second? Are you
I
okay with the
continue to
change?
second. I second.
Okay.
okay,
Got to keep them honest.
okay.
Squared now.
So let's see, do we need to extend the meeting at this point? Oh, I will do that. We don't want to mix up 2 minutes, huh? 2 minutes, but I think he has some more stuff.
Mine will be very quick.
Okay. All right, so, are all those in favor of the motion as amended? Is that correct? Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, motion carries unanimously with Cabe and Hampton absent excused.
Okay. And just picking up on Commissioner Kurt's comment about if you do come and speak to the council, you're authorized as the chair through this letter to do that. If other commissioners speak, you can speak to the content of the letter. Anything different, you need to be speaking on your own behalf, not the commission's behalf.
Great. Thanks, Commissioner Pystrup. Let's see.
Question, would that be in the beginning of the meeting as part of the public comments?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And if the letter comes in ahead of time, I would submit the letter to the clerk if you want to submit it ahead of time, and then it will go in the desk packet for the council. Or you can deliver it at the council meeting when you speak.
Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, we have 45 seconds.
45 seconds.
Yeah, so let's see. Staff report?
I'll do it in 20 seconds.
Okay.
So last night at council, they had a briefing on the multifamily tax exemption program, just to give you an update on that. We got some good direction from them. We're continuing to work on that. Again, that won't come back to the commission, but we'll keep you posted. We are in the process of hiring a consultant for the 2 commerce grants that we have for duplexes and corner lots and increasing the number of lots in short plats. Also for our critical areas ordinance update and our best available science update. In fact, Lisa will be working on that. And then also we have 6 applications for the 3 openings on the Planning Commission. The council will be doing interviews on February 11th, making a decision, I believe, in March.
Great, thank you. Okay, and all those in favor of adjournment say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, we are adjourned.